People often say that our earliest memories begin somewhere around the age of 3. Yet Tracy's first memory reaches further back, to a time when she was only 2 years old. It is not really a sequence of events, and not even a clear recollection of what happened. It is more like a single image frozen in time, something resembling an old black and white Polaroid photograph. And that image is tied to a terrible day. Tracy Raquel was born in 1969. The story of her parents' relationship was complicated long before she was old enough to understand it. Her mother, Kathy Allman, was born and raised in DeKalb County, Georgia, where she spent most of her life. When she was 14, a cheerful high school cheerleader, Kathy met Gene Barry Sandlin. Gene was the kind of boy everyone at school knew. He was athletic, confident, playful, and extremely popular among the students. Many girls were drawn to him, and Kathy was one of them. She later admitted that she had been in love with Gene since she was 12 years old. Their relationship unfolded mostly in secret. Throughout their school years, they met quietly whenever they could, careful not to attract attention. But their romance was never stable. Their story moved in fragments, interrupted by frequent separations and long periods of uncertainty. Gene often continued seeing other girls, and Kathy had to accept that reality more than once. In 1965, when Kathy was only 15 years old, she became pregnant with Gene's child. The pregnancy ended with an illegal abortion performed at home. After that, Kathy's parents strictly forbade her from seeing Gene, warning her that he was trouble and came from a bad family. Sometime later, Kathy began dating another young man, Ted Golder. Ted was quiet, reserved, and very different from Gene. When Ted was drafted into the army, Kathy discovered she was pregnant again. The two married quickly. Despite her marriage to Ted, Kathy continued her secret relationship with Gene, her first love from school. She saw him whenever the opportunity appeared, even after Gene himself married a woman named Nancy Tegader. His marriage changed little in the dynamic between them. When Ted was eventually sent overseas to serve in the war, Kathy's life once again shifted. In early 1971, she became pregnant again and told Gene that the child was his, just as she insisted her first daughter Tracy had been. Gene was not entirely convinced. In an attempt to prove her devotion to him, Kathy wrote a letter to Ted. In that letter, she confessed that she loved another man. She told him that Tracy was not truly his daughter, and that she was now expecting a child from the man she loved. Ted, despite everything, was willing to forgive her. He was prepared to raise the children with her and try to keep the family together. But Kathy had already made up her mind. On August 9, 1971, her son Matthew Golder was born. Just 1 month later, Gene's wife Nancy died by suicide. In a sudden and tragic turn of events, the man Kathy had loved for years was now free. Within weeks of Nancy's death, Gene turned to Kathy for comfort, and Kathy welcomed him without hesitation. She moved in with Gene together with her 2 children in Decatur, Georgia, in a 3-story apartment building. Then came the day that would remain etched in Tracy's memory forever. It was December 27, 1971. That day, Kathy took Tracy with her to a laundromat, while Gene stayed at home with baby Matthew. When Kathy returned, she brought Tracy into the living room and placed her in a chair. Gene was sitting on the couch nearby. Kathy said she wanted to check on Matthew. Gene stopped her and told her the baby was sleeping. He suggested that she first bring the laundry from the car and fold it so the noise would not wake the boy. Trusting him, Kathy stepped outside. When she returned with the laundry, Tracy was no longer sitting in the chair where she had left her. Kathy began putting the laundry away and walked past the children's room. Inside, she saw something that immediately filled her with dread. Her daughter was standing near the crib, and baby Matthew was lying on the floor, completely unconscious. Kathy rushed toward him, desperately trying to wake him, but he did not respond. Panic quickly took over. The family rushed him to Northside Hospital, the same hospital where Matthew had been born. Doctors quickly performed X-rays. The results were alarming. The child needed immediate surgery. Meanwhile, relatives began gathering at the hospital. Kathy's parents arrived, along with her sisters, and Jean's older brother also came to wait for news. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos was 2-year-old Tracy. Her first memory. She is standing on the back seat of the family car, holding onto the headrest for balance, while flashes of red and blue light from the ambulances dance across the interior of the vehicle, scattering bright reflections through the dark cabin. That is the image that stayed with her, her very first memory. And then, everything seemed to stop, as if the world had suddenly turned black and white. Matthew was in critical condition. He had multiple skull fractures and a severe brain injury, and his pupils were fixed and dilated. Doctors rushed him into emergency surgery. The neurosurgeon warned the family that the chances of survival were very small. A few hours later, Matthew died. After that, Tracy remembered the days as heavy and grey, and the nights as endless and unusually dark. The loss of the child pushed Kathy into serious mental health problems. 2 months after Matthew's death, Kathy silently took her daughter by the hand and led her out onto the balcony. Then, right in front of Tracy, she jumped from the 2nd floor. Kathy survived, but both of her arms and both of her legs were broken. While she lay in bed covered in casts, she began ordering 2-year-old Tracy to do things around the house, even telling the little girl to cook scrambled eggs for her. By the time Tracy turned 3, the arguments between the adults had become constant. They shouted at each other so loudly that neighbours could hear everything. Tracy was often left alone outside with no supervision. When people later asked her about that time, Tracy said she felt invisible. And then things became even worse. Parental care and supervision were things Tracy barely knew. It is hard for any responsible parent to imagine a situation where a 3-year-old child is left outside alone for long periods of time. One incident happened when Tracy was not yet 4 years old. Jean was taking a shower and called his daughter over. He handed her a cigarette and told her to bring it to Kathy. Tracy either didn't hear him or didn't understand what he wanted, and she simply stood there. Jean responded by pressing the burning cigarette against her skin. By the time she was 5, most of the household responsibilities had fallen on her shoulders. If the electricity or water was cut off, Kathy sent the child to stand in line to pay the bills. Tracy also bought cigarettes and beer for the adults. Another image remained in her memory. A small blonde girl reaching toward the cashier with money in her hand and quietly asking, "Please, can I have a pack of Virginia Slims?" Jean took pills and drank alcohol almost constantly. Kathy often screamed in drunken rage while he beat and assaulted her. Their home was filled with chaos. What had once been a teenage romance had turned into something dark and destructive. During the worst of their fights, Tracy would take a glass of milk and some cookies and sit in front of the television, watching the sitcom The Brady Bunch. It became her small escape from reality. Later, in that same chaotic environment, another child was born, Jason. Most of the time it was Tracy who cared for him. She did everything she could for her mother, yet she never received even the smallest word of gratitude. Nothing at all. The arrival of another child did nothing to calm Jean's aggression. In the middle of the night, he would sometimes appear drunk and force Kathy and the children out of the apartment. They would wander the streets and sometimes sleep wherever they could, even on a park bench. Then he would suddenly allow them to return home, and the cycle would begin again. For Tracy, life was completely unpredictable. Each day seemed to bring a new emotional or physical danger. Kathy, however, was hardly kinder than Jean. Her cruelty simply took a different form. When Tracy was 7, chewing gum became tangled in her hair. When the girl asked her mother for help, Kathy reacted instantly. Without hesitation, she shaved her daughter's head completely bald. Long strands of golden hair fell into. Tracy would later recall that no one in the family ever really spoke about Matthew's death. Whenever Tracy asked about her brother, she was always given the same answer: that he had simply hit his head. One day in 1977, while walking home from a store, Tracy said to her mother, "The day after tomorrow is Matthew's birthday. If you don't take me to the cemetery, I will never speak to you again." Kathy was stunned by the request, but the parents never took her there. Instead, that evening, Jean beat Tracy with a belt. Physical punishment of children was not unusual in those days, but what happened in that house was something far darker. It was not discipline. It was cruelty, a relentless desire to inflict pain. Kathy often fell into long periods of apathy. It was as if life simply drained out of her, leaving behind only an empty shell. She showed no warmth, no care, no interest in what was happening around her. Her relationship with Jean followed a strange cycle. At times he behaved like the perfect husband, bringing flowers and paying attention to the family. But at other times, he became frighteningly sadistic and violent. When Tracy was 10 years old, Jean was suddenly arrested. She did not know why or what he had done. She would not learn the reason for many years. For Tracy, however, it felt like the best day of her life. Kathy, on the other hand, withdrew even further into herself. Tracy had already grown used to her mother's emotional distance, but now the silence in the house became even heavier. Still, there was one relief. Tracy was no longer afraid to come home. At school, she was an excellent student and even became a cheerleader. But the weight of her childhood followed her into adolescence. At 14, she was hospitalized and diagnosed with an epileptic disorder. Around that time, Tracy collected a 30-day supply of her anti-seizure medication and swallowed all of the pills at once. In that moment, she believed she would join Matthew somewhere in a better place. She thought that a month's worth of medication would be enough to end her life. But instead, she woke up to the sound of her mother shaking her and repeating in panic, "Oh my God, what have you done?" Later, Kathy would try to use that incident against her. One night, she drove Tracy to a psychiatric hospital and told the staff that her daughter was a danger to herself and possibly to others. Hearing those words shocked Tracy. It felt as if her mother simply wanted to get rid of her. Tracy spent 2 days in that hospital, the worst 48 hours of her life. She shared a ward with children suffering from severe mental illnesses and even with young violent offenders. She was terrified. She was afraid someone might hurt her, afraid even to fall asleep, and she spent every moment watching the other patients around her. Eventually, her Aunt June, Kathy's sister, intervened and took her out of the hospital. Though she returned Tracy to her mother's home, she later helped her find work in her beauty salon. Tracy had worked there before. When she was 9 years old, she swept the floors on Friday and Saturday evenings during the summer. But once she started high school, the job became much more serious, with long hours and real responsibility. Still, one question never left her mind. What had really happened to Matthew? Whenever Tracy tried to ask about her brother's death, she was met with hostility from relatives. No one wanted to talk about it. Her mother's reaction disturbed her the most. Kathy, who had seemed emotionally numb for years, suddenly exploded with anger whenever Matthew was mentioned. She would start shouting, which only strengthened Tracy's determination to find the truth. During those years, Tracy had one person she could rely on, a close friend and neighbour named Ryan Fleming. He became her emotional support. Ryan's family had connections within the police, and through them he managed to help Tracy gain access to the official report about her brother's death. She was 15 years old when she finally saw the documents. What she discovered shocked her. There had been no real investigation. She continued living with Kathy until she turned 18. By then, Tracy had a job and managed to rent a small apartment. She moved out and cut contact with her mother. Later, she would remember that time clearly. "I was constantly afraid. I barely slept," she said. Eventually, she decided the only way to survive was to become physically strong enough to protect herself. That belief led her to the military. She told herself, "I'll join the army, go through ranger training, jump out of airplanes, and learn every skill that will make me stronger than anyone who might try to hurt me. Then no one would ever be able to harm her again." In 1988, Tracy enlisted in the army. Over the following years, she moved from base to base, living in Hawaii, Colorado, Alabama, and several other states. Home became wherever her family happened to be stationed. Eventually, Tracy married a soldier named Bart. They had 2 children together. On the surface, her life looked stable and safe, and Tracy had learned to hide the pain she carried inside. Meanwhile, Gene was serving a life sentence for an armed robbery in Florida. By then, he had already spent 15 years in prison, and the possibility of parole was slowly approaching. Although Tracy saw herself as strong, the thought of Gene walking free terrified her. She believed he was connected to Matthew's death. As the possibility of his release grew closer, everything suddenly felt urgent. Tracy began making calls and contacting anyone who might help reopen the case. But when she approached authorities in DeKalb County, they showed little interest. The case was too old, they said. They simply did not have time to investigate it. That was when Tracy turned to a private investigator named Jim Mabey. Mabey had more than 30 years of experience in law enforcement. He had worked in patrol, later becoming a detective who investigated homicide cases, and eventually moved into forensic work, specializing in determining causes of death. During one conversation, Tracy mentioned that her father was Gene Barry Sandlin. The name immediately caught Mabey's attention. Years earlier, he had been assigned to an unsolved case involving the death of a police officer around the same time Matthew had died, and one of the suspects had been Gene Sandlin. Mabey also knew that Gene had once robbed a gas station convenience store in Panama City, Florida, and exchanged gunfire with police before being arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison. It was not his first conviction. He had already served time for crimes such as forgery and burglary. That was the moment Tracy remembered from childhood, when she was 10 years old and Gene was taken away from the family. Now, however, there was a real chance he might be released early. At Mabey's request, Tracy convinced her mother to request Matthew's medical records from the hospital. In early 1993, 22 years after Matthew's death, the records finally arrived. Tracy held the envelope in her hands. The documents were from DeKalb Hospital, dated December 1971. Patient, Matthew Stephen Golder. The X-rays described extensive skull fractures, mostly on the left side. Medical notes reported massive brain trauma. The brain was severely bruised and swollen. Matthew was in a coma and breathing irregularly. Doctors believed he was dying. Then Tracy read the line that shattered everything she thought she knew. According to the report, the mother had told doctors that Matthew's 2-year-old sister had thrown him out of the crib. Tracy remembered that moment as the instant her world collapsed. According to the official record, it was Tracy who had killed her own brother. And for more than 20 years, she believed it might be true. But the real investigation was only beginning. In part 2, we'll see how soon after she arrived, her brother Jason called her with disturbing news. He said their father had made threats against her. Jean had reportedly said he would burn Tracy alive and watch her die. Jason refused to repeat some of the other things that had been said, telling her only that they were too horrible. Meanwhile, the trial continued. Under the rules of witness sequestration, anyone scheduled to testify was not allowed to watch the proceedings on television. But when Tracy arrived home, members of her husband's family were watching the trial broadcast in their living room. As she passed through the room, she briefly saw her mother on the screen. Later that evening, Assistant District Attorney Lynn Mangoni called her. "Your mother testified today," she said. "Everything went well." "Yes," Tracy replied. "I caught a glimpse of it on television." She later insisted it had been accidental and had lasted only a few seconds. But those few seconds were enough. The information had to be reported immediately to Judge Hilton Fuller. Everyone hoped he would allow the trial to continue, since Tracy had already finished her testimony and the incident had not affected the course of the case. The prosecution informed the court. The defense immediately demanded a mistrial. "I didn't know I had violated Jean's rights," Tracy later recalled saying. "It seems he has more rights than I do." "You are not facing life in prison," Attorney Mull responded sharply. "I've already spent my life imprisoned by these events," Tracy replied. Soon afterward, Judge Fuller ruled that there had been a serious violation of the sequestration rule. The defense's motion for a mistrial was granted. It was a devastating blow. All of this was accompanied by a deep sense of humiliation and anger. No one seemed to enjoy that moment more than Jean. When Tracy, completely devastated, returned home, the phone rang. It was Jean. For a few seconds he said nothing. In the background, a television or recording could be heard describing an accident in which a lawnmower had run over a little girl's legs. It sounded like a story, but Tracy understood the message. It was the first indirect threat toward her children. "I always win," Jean finally said before hanging up. The prosecution was furious. The decision about whether the case could be retried, something the prosecutors desperately wanted, now rested with Judge Fuller. The judge allowed a new trial. 2 months later, everyone returned to court. When the second trial began in September 1997, the atmosphere was even more tense. It felt as if everything was hanging by a thread. Both sides had to present their cases again. The overall theory of the case had not changed much, but new witnesses appeared. One of them was Tracy's grandmother, who recalled an incident in which Jean, left alone with Matthew, had supposedly gotten ground pepper into the baby's eyes. The defense, however, focused their attacks on Kathy. Now they openly suggested that she herself might have been responsible. On September 26, 1997, the jury delivered its verdict. Gene Sandlin was found guilty of felony murder on 2 counts. For each count, he received a sentence of life imprisonment. But defense attorney Corinne Mull was not someone who accepted defeat easily. The defense filed a motion requesting yet another trial. In a remarkable move, Mull even argued that she herself had been ineffective during the proceedings, essentially sacrificing her own reputation in order to reopen the case. A year after Jean's conviction, Tracy received a call from the prosecutor's office, informing her that the case would indeed be reviewed again. She began to feel as if it would never end. In October 1998, a new element entered the process. Jean's new defense attorney, Stephen Sado. He openly explained his role. "No matter how terrible a crime may seem," he said, "my job is not to judge. My job is to defend my client and try to obtain an acquittal." His strategy was simple: to argue that under certain circumstances, almost anything could have happened. Sado attempted to revive the theory that 2-year-old Tracy had somehow injured her brother, striking him with a shoe, lifting him from the crib and dropping him onto the floor. He made Tracy the central target of the defense and repeated Kathy's earlier statement that the girl had been unusually strong and intelligent for her age. There are many possibilities in this story, he argued, and possibilities cannot be proof of guilt. During the earlier trials, Kathy had spoken mostly about the abuse she herself had endured. She suggested that the trauma explained why her memories were inconsistent and why her behavior sometimes seemed irrational. But now Tracy realized something important. If the jury was to understand who Jean truly was, she would have to tell her own story. She spoke about the cigarette burns he had inflicted on her skin. She described the nightmares that still haunted her, memories from childhood. Cockroaches, toast covered in grease, punishments Jean had forced on her. He made her eat those things while humiliating her in ways she could barely describe. On November 3rd, 1998, the verdict came once again. Jean Barry Sandlin was found guilty. Years later, Jean would tell a journalist that he had allowed all of this to happen. According to him, he had remained silent to protect someone he cared about, someone who supposedly felt guilty. Prison, he said, had never frightened him. And now, he claimed, he resented Tracy for accusing him. As of 2023, Tracy lives a quiet and peaceful life in Savannah, Georgia, with her husband Bart, whom she describes as the partner who helped her survive the hardest years of her life. They have 2 children, Goldie and Hunter. Today, the couple are also grandparents. Tracy has said publicly that her mother should have been held accountable as well. She stopped being my mother the moment she chose to blame her own daughter, Tracy once stated. She no longer has any contact with Kathy. Kathy Allman now lives with her sister Sheila in a rural area of Georgia. When reporters first asked her to comment after Jean Sandlin's conviction, Kathy said very little. She simply insisted that Tracy had lied in court and claimed that both children had been happy and had enjoyed a good childhood. Later, she asked her sister Sheila to speak on her behalf. Sheila argued that Tracy had exaggerated or even fabricated the stories of abuse from her childhood. According to her, Jean had only spanked the girl once, after catching her smoking a cigarette. She also accused Tracy of destroying Kathy's life merely to gain attention. Yet Tracy had spoken publicly about her childhood only during the final court proceedings. In the end, Kathy's position appeared unchanged. Perhaps it was simply easier for her not to confront the weight of guilt. In recent years, she has lived a quiet and isolated life, preferring to be left alone. She has no contact with her daughter and shows no interest in rebuilding that relationship. Tracy never received an apology. She never got an explanation, never got a reason why everyone around her chose silence over truth for more than 20 years. But she did get something. She got her name back. And for the first time in her life, she knew, without any doubt, that what happened to Matthew was never her fault. She was 2 years old. She was innocent. And she always had been. If Tracy's story stayed with you, leave a like. It helps more people find cases like this one. And if you want to know how this all began, the hospital record, the silence, the people who knew the truth all along, that story is in part 1, linked right here. Subscribe if you want more cases that go deeper than the headlines. A new video is coming this week.